I know what it means to choose the cinder path. You might say death, but I prefer taking pains with the world. The signpost ahead, which bears no inscription. That elm tree withstanding the terrible heat of its oily green flame.
Andrew, thanks for coming in. You're passionate about poets reading their own work, aren't you, rather than actors?
Yes, I think there are actors who do it very well. Simon Russell Beale, Ralph Fiennes, Paul Schofield used to read poems fantastically well. But there is in a lot of actors, I'm inclined to say too many actors, but I don't mean to antagonise them, a tendency to feel that the words need interpretation in a way that poets themselves often don't feel they need to demonstrate.
When you're reading just now, you respect the ends of the lines and the stanza breaks much more than I think any actor would.
It allows a sense of the form of the thing to enter the mind of the listener, reader. And also it allows a little suspense to occur at a very regular way so that you're not quite sure what you're coming round the corner to find waiting for you when you get to the beginning of the next line. And by and large, the poets that I like best do that very skillfully, and I've tried to sort of pick up their good habits about this. I'm thinking, as I say this, particularly of Edward Thomas, who is a brilliant negotiator of the unit that a line is, the unit that a verse is, and the unit that a whole poem is.
This collection is the first after a period where you found it difficult to write poetry for yourself.
Yes.
What was it that released that block?
Well, I think the block had something to do with my writing other things. I wrote a book about my childhood in the middle of my Laureate decade, and that seemed to draw on the same sort of wells, reservoirs, whatever, as my poems do, a lot of which are about childhood themselves. It had something to do with the feeling of being looked at as Laureate. Hard to look if you feel looked at.
Is that kind of scrutiny difficult for a poet in particular?
Possibly. I mean, I found it difficult anyway. I mean, there might be sorts of poets who wouldn't, but I found it difficult. And there was something else going on too, which was that I'd got a bit bored with the music in my head that was the music I heard whenever I wrote a poem, and I wanted to change.
When you found it, did it feel like you were returning to something?
It was a return to certain formal expertises which I hoped that I had developed over the years. And it wasn't as though I changed all my loyalties as a writer. I mean, I still like the people I've always liked, and don't like the people I don't much like, and so on and so on. But it felt new, almost literally in terms of cadence. The lines are slightly longer, or the units of sound in the poems are slightly longer, in most cases, than they are in my previous books. And that just allows me to say slightly different sorts of things, and again, to use this phrase, makes different sorts of subjects available.
So there's also a lot of material in the collection about the First and Second World War.
Yes, it's odd that, isn't it?
I was wondering what the attraction of the wars for a poet. It's the beginning of a new century. Why do those still speak to you? We
might be thinking more these days about Iraq and Afghanistan than we are about what it was like in the trenches, though we sort of never stop thinking about life in the trenches. But as we do that, think about wars in the present, we can't help seeing them, particularly in those two countries, actually, in the context of other and earlier wars. So the poem about the First World War might equally well be a poem about Iraq or Afghanistan, in my account of it, I mean, in the sense that I'm talking here.
Is there also an element of measuring yourself as a man who's lived through peace, measuring yourself up against men who did not?
You pretty much took the words out of my mouth. I mean, I think that is the other great drive for me in this. I have a lot of early memories of watching my father, who'd stayed on in the Territorial Army after the war, going off pretty much every weekend in uniform to play soldiers, my mother would rather resentfully say, and feeling that, well, feeling two things very strongly and simultaneously. One was dead lucky. I'm the first person in my father's family to go to university, not because nobody could afford it, so not, as it were, meaning quite what Kinnock meant when he said that all those years ago, but because everybody else had been off to fight. So partly dead lucky. And also, would I shape up? I mean, how does a person whose male family has almost crucially defined themselves, their maleness, in those sorts of terms, physical courage, putting your life on the line, being a soldier, how does somebody who hasn't had that threat and perhaps opportunity, how do they measure it? Being brave, and people sometimes talk about the writer's bravery. Bullshit. It's as nothing compared to having bullets pinging off your ass in Afghanistan or wherever it might be.
Do you see yourself following in the footsteps of war poets like Sassoon?
I've always thought I was a war poet, actually. I just didn't have a war. And I wish during the last 10 years that somebody had sent me to one, I have to say. And I know that might sound rather sort of vulgar. And I have to hope, of course, that if it had happened, or were still to happen, I wouldn't write about it in a vulgar, sort of touristic way.
Are there other things you'd change about the way the poster's put together? Other things you'd do differently? I mean, would you have written fewer of the poems that you did?
I would earlier on have said there is a particular complication about writing these role poems. I mean, I've ended up saying that loud and clear, and I haven't done very many of them throughout, but I would have, knowing what I now know, I would have taken that bull by the horns a bit earlier on. Strangely difficult to ignore the sort of the raw coming from some newspapers for those poems to exist. But the rest of it I've done pretty much as I meant to do, which is to say to split it in my mind's eye into a doing bit and a writing bit, and to make the doing bit crucially around educational matters of one kind or another. I'm very proud of the Poetry Archive, which now has an enormous audience and is beginning to make quite a significant impact on the way that poetry is being taught in schools. Personally, I wish that I'd found it easier to reserve a bit more of my own time for my own writing, because then it might not have been 7 years before the Cinder Path came out, but equally, I decided to go about it in the way that I did go about it, so I can't really complain about that. A garden in Japan. Between crows at dawn, barking the latest news of their shogun ancestors, and sparrows at dusk, debating the meaning of a fragile economy, the international garden discovers a stillness absolute as brushwork. Slow carp might stir the long lily roots with their silk kimonos. Clouds will definitely drag the odd shadow across duckweed lawns. But the one real event will be my decision to lift a red leaf from the fang of rock overhanging this pool, and so free the current to fall to earth, which will never again be one and the same.